When you go into accounting, you think of it as a technical endeavor, but it's really about relationships. Be engaged in what you're doing. Don't look at it as a clinical exercise. And I find that generates some of the most interesting conversations. Some people do some really fascinating things. People that are engaged in interesting things outside of work are more likely to be successful. My name is Steve Farnham. I'm the founding partner of Farnham & Company, Chartered Accountants. I never really wanted to be an accountant. My father was an accountant, and I grew up in that environment and wanted to do something different. And ended up becoming an accountant by default. In university, it appeared that the only way to get a job was to graduate as an accountant. So I graduated from University of Toronto in the Commerce program, and went to work for a firm called Clarkson Gordon, at the time now Ernst & Young. I worked with them in Mississauga for 4 years, and then was transferred to their New Zealand affiliate for 2 years, where I worked, and came back and ended up joining my father's firm, despite my initial reluctance, and have been here ever since. A piece of advice I guess I'd give to somebody who is thinking about this as a career is be curious. It'll make for a much more satisfying career. Be engaged in what you're doing. Don't look at it as a clinical exercise. Particularly in the private enterprise space, entrepreneurs are fascinating. And they're larger than life in a lot of cases, and it's a privilege to work with these folks. And so be curious about your clients. Be curious about the work you're doing, so it doesn't just become a mill. And I think that's probably the most important attribute, I would say. I look for authenticity. Technical skills are important and level dependent, and that's sort of the baseline, but lots of people have the appropriate technical skills. It's about finding people who are authentic. And so when I'm interviewing, I'm probing to see if we're talking to people that are not robots, I guess, that are interested and engaged in things even outside of accounting. I like to ask about what they like to do when they're not working. And sometimes that leads to some really interesting discussions. But I think if you're engaged in the world, you're going to be more relatable to clients and able to build those relationships because you'll have points of interest in common. When I'm looking at somebody's resume, initially I'm looking for experience that is applicable to the role, obviously. Not always. Sometimes somebody can have an experience that can translate into what we're looking for, but the chances of success, I think, are larger if you've had somebody who has at least seen something along the lines of the role you're trying to fill, rather than sometimes we get resumes from people who think they want to do this. They've been in industry, for example. They think they want to try public accounting. For me, that's a high risk because they don't know. And I've taken chances on people like that, but I prefer somebody who's got more alignment in terms of experience. What is the best way for somebody to deal with gaps in their resume? I mean, you can't really repair a gap. It is what it is, it's history. But be prepared to talk about those in a very forthright way and explain them. And usually there's an explanation that will make sense, but don't try to cover it up or make excuses for it. Life is life, and if there's a gap, there's a gap. Now, sometimes there's a reason for a gap that can be problematic in terms of something they don't want to share, which is going to be an issue for us, but it's best to be honest. I would prefer somebody, even if it's a difficult issue creating a gap, to address it. That would be meaningful in terms of building trust. My favorite interview question is, what do you do when you're not working? Because they're all prepared for their career progression and their education and their strengths, but they're not always prepared for a question about what they do for fun. And I find that generates some of the most interesting conversations, because you never know what people do for fun. And some people don't do anything for fun, and then those are the people I don't want to hire. But some people do some really fascinating things. And I think that people that are engaged in interesting things outside of work are more likely to be successful at the higher levels of the firm. If you want to progress to manager and senior manager and principal and partner, it is about relationship building, which means that you have the ability to engage with people, not just about accounting. In my experience, candidates are not necessarily prepared for technical questions, and we tend to fire out a few in our process just to, you can very quickly determine whether what they're saying in words lines up with what their experience really is. There's people that can talk, and there's people that you just know through asking questions they know how to do. And the technical questions pull that out. And a lot of times that comes as a surprise. So one question that I asked in an interview just yesterday was, what do you think comprises the revenue line for our firm? It sounds like a simple question, but this individual was coming out of a manufacturing environment where what lands on the revenue line is related to invoices for goods that are manufactured and shipped. What lands on our revenue line is hours people put in, which is a little more nuanced. And I wanted to see if the candidate understood the nature of the business that they were applying for. What are the key metrics in an accounting firm that generate revenue? I think it's challenging for international candidates on a number of fronts. Communication can be a challenge. Technical issues such as taxation can be a challenge. I think the more that they can prepare in advance in terms of becoming familiar, depending on the role, again, with Canadian tax laws, Canadian standards for financial statements, rather than expecting to learn it all on the job, or at least demonstrate that they've got the initiative to try to do some legwork themselves, would be helpful. Outside of that, again, it just comes down to experience. We've hired quite a few people here whose previous experience was all overseas, and they've turned out to be some of our most successful people here, which is terrific. And it adds to the dynamic of the firm and the flavor of the firm. I embrace that. Advice I would give to recent grads would be to do your homework, try to understand the role that you're applying for as much as possible before the interview. Talk to colleagues, talk to professors, get a sense of what it is you think you're getting into. For new grads, the technical aspects are not as rigorous, but there is a requirement to have some base level of technical knowledge, and we will always test that through the interview process. So be prepared, but be yourself in the interview and be natural, and that's the best advice I can give. I think one of the things I've learned from my career and from my clients is gratitude. Success can be fleeting, health can be fragile, and you develop these relationships with clients over long periods of time, decades, and you see all of these cycles. Mostly, I'm grateful for the relationships I have with my clients and my team, the success we've had as a firm, and I don't take it for granted. The importance of building authentic relationships with clients. When you go into accounting, you think of it as a technical endeavor, as a mathematical maybe endeavor, but it's really about relationships. And people that thrive in this environment are people that enjoy relationships, that are curious about people, that are engaged. And I guess, I don't know if it would have changed anything if I'd known it back then, but it's something that I discovered along the journey.